exploratory data analysis of a regional nonprofit and family services organization. My name is Allison, and I worked with a team along with Hailey and Eleri to do this project.
So going into about our client, so we worked with a nonprofit organization that provides counseling and services for teens, young adults, and families who are in crisis, homeless, and disadvantaged in the greater St. Louis area. We then looked into about the data, and then we'll also look into key definitions. So about our data, so we worked with two different scoring measures. So that was with over 25,000 data entries. And then we also took that data and cleaned it. So any of that missing data or invalid columns, anything that would skew our outcome, we were able to get rid of. And then we took a better understanding of our client's key definitions. So that's scoring measures and discharge codes.
So talking a little bit more about the specific metrics that they used. First, we have the outcome rating scale, which we will refer to as the ORS. This is a score range from 0 to 40, and it has 4 different parts that add up to that total score. So it looks at individual, interpersonal, social, and then overall. The score significance for this metric is below 28 for youth, and then a score below 25 for individuals 18 plus. So those are like the scores to look for, like concerning scores would be below those measures. And then this is completed by the client, whereas the Children's Global Assessment Scale of Functioning, which we will refer to as the CGAS, is on a scale from 0 to 100. With 1 to 14 being extremely impaired, and then 95 to 100 being doing extremely well. This measure is completed by the provider.
So then looking at our client discharge codes, so these were the codes that we were given. So we have plan PDA, which is plan discharge above. So this is the ideal outcome where the client met or exceeded their target well-being. So then we also have plan discharge below. So this is where the client completed the program but probably did not meet their target well-being. And then we have plan discharge none, where there's no outcome data. And then we have dropout, which is our client did leave services before completing the program. Then we have UPDA, so that's that plan discharge above. So the client was showing improvement but chose to leave the program before their plan completion. And then NA, so not available. So then that outcome was not recorded either because the client was still receiving outcome or there was a data entry error.
Okay, so looking in after we knew a little bit more about our data, and with talking with our client, we came up with 3 areas of research questions. So the first is along the scoring scales. So looking at if the ORS and the CGAS methods differ from one another, and then also looking into predictive relationships between which variables are best predictors of those scoring outcomes. And then finally, the impact of COVID-19, which is something our client really wanted us to look at, is how COVID impacted clients before, during, and then after.
So then we look into our descriptive statistics, so that will be our demographics. So our client races were white and African American. That accounted for about 90% of our client data. We then looked into that zip code analysis. So we found that St. Louis County, St. Louis City, and St. Charles County, those were the most frequent counties for our clients' residencies. Further down, we'll look into ORS and CGAS score comparison, as well as COVID-19 impact on score change and that program analysis.
Okay, so looking at ORS and CGAS change by gender. So female and male clients make up the vast majority of our sample, over 11,000 and 9,000 cases for both of them, and then both show slightly positive trends on both measures. Then female to male clients also trend positively, but self-report scores are slightly ahead of the provider ratings. And the non-binary clients are the only group showing a negative trend, but with only 64 cases, we can't really draw any firm conclusions because any kind of outliers will be heavily skewing that data. And then importantly, across all groups, the relationships are pretty weak. So time in the program alone does not strongly predict how much a client improves. This is consistent with what we see in broader literature in psychology. So the APA, the American Psychological Association, notes that on average, 15 to 20 sessions are needed for 50% of patients to recover. So that tells us that improvement isn't going to be just a function of how long someone stays in treatment, but it also could be due to other factors within that program.
Okay, so going into the impact of COVID-19, first we classified our three groups as pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID, with that during COVID group as being defined as a session 1 date on or after March 13th of 2020, all the way until December 31st of 2021. This group we found these dates by looking at our area data and when those shutdown dates were most prevalent in our area. So looking into the graphs now, we can see that for both graphs, the pre-COVID group has an overall higher score change than the other two groups for length of enrollment, by length of enrollment. So this is saying that that group performed better over time than the other two groups, whereas the during COVID group is overall generally the lowest of the three. And then we can also see that from the two graphs side by side that the slopes differ pretty heavily. So we can see that there are some discrepancies among the two different scoring metrics. So going further into this, this of the COVID-19, we ran a linear regression of both the score change for the ORS and the score change for the CGAS. So looking at number of days enrolled, the slope is 0 for both models, which shows that as number of days increases, the score change increases by 0 or very close to 0, which is showing the generic trend that we've seen throughout all of our data, that the number of days enrolled in a program isn't necessarily indicative of a better score or better score change. And then we can also see that from the interaction terms, there is a small relationship between number of days enrolled and the COVID classification. So it isn't necessarily correct to say that people during COVID would have a longer stay or vice versa. And then from this model overall, we can see that the R-squared adjusted value is 0.003 for the ORS score change, and then 0.016 for the CGAS score change, which overall is a very low R-squared value, saying that both of these models aren't accounting for much of the variability in the score change.
Okay, so because we had over 25,000 rows of data, we looked at individual program data to look closer at what may be impacting discharge results and to more accurately make recommendations to our clients and point out any patterns. So overall, the PDA counts are consistently the highest, except for going into 2025, and that's likely due to the NA values towards 2025 most likely reflects clients who are currently still active and hasn't received a discharge code yet. So, but we do see a peak in discharges around 2017 for this program, which most likely reflects just a large client influx rather than like a sudden shift in those outcomes. However, it is good that the dropout code remained low during this period, even though that was a high demand period. So the program handled that high caseload and handled a high caseload well, and their PDA remained at the top. However, there was a large influx of PDB clients as well, which means planned discharge below. So they had a planned discharge, but they were below their goal. So that would be something for the client to note that they may need to handle that better in the future. But in general, they do have positive trends as the PDA remains the highest score. And then to look at that program, but by active provider being that they had a client with their first or last session score in 2025, as this data was pulled in December of 2025. So we do see some meaningful differences. Provider 186 carries the highest caseload, and the large majority of their discharges are planned and above, so that is a positive sign for that provider. They're kind of killing it. And then provider 300 stands out with a notably higher proportion of dropouts relative to their total cases, as you can see on the right in that relativity graph. And so that would be something for our client to know and that program to know that that provider might need just a little bit more support or more guidance. And then provider 168 has a noticeable PDB rate, meaning clients are finishing treatment but not fully meeting their goals. So that would be also something to look into for that provider. And yeah. But in general, most of their providers are doing very well. And the one provider with only NA so far most likely means that they have just started receiving clients and those clients have not yet left services. And then looking more into those active providers, but looking by the ORS and CGAS change over time per those providers, we do see some differing trends as well. Some providers showed stronger positive trends than others, and the relationship between time and outcome looks different depending on who is delivering the services. So that suggests that the provider themselves may play a more significant role in their clients' outcomes than just the duration, because as we've seen, those duration and time for change in score isn't necessarily a huge indicator of how that change is actually happening for those clients. So that would be worth exploring further for our client as programs continue to collect data and see which providers are also rating their clients and their CGAS scores higher than the clients are rating themselves. As we can see for provider 212, there's definitely a discrepancy there in how the provider is rating their client and how the client is rating themselves. So these in general are trends that our client would want to look at further.
So then going further, we're going to look into machine learning models. So that's predicting most recent session scores, as well as predicting score change versus overall scores.
So the first machine learning model that we ran is a random forest model. So for this model, we ran it twice, once for the most recent session ORS score, and then a second time for the most recent session CGAS score. And the predictors we used for this model are the session 1 section scores, so those 4 different categories that we talked about at the beginning, as well as the session 1 score from the alternative metric. So if we were running the ORS model, we used the session 1 CGAS score. And then we also looked at the season of the session 1 and the discharge. So this was looking at if seasons had any impact on those scores. And then we also looked at length of enrollment, race, gender, county of residence, and also, yeah, that's what we looked at. And then we omitted the most recent session section scores because those do add up to the total ORS score, as well as the discharge code and the risk rating scores, because those would all be overfitting the model as well. And then finally, we omitted the programs and the provider IDs because Random Forest really likes splits. So these two just had way too many, and it was saying that those account for a lot more of the variability than we know that they did. So looking at our results here, this is for predicting the most recent session ORS total score. So this model overall had a variability score of 25.41% and a R-squared value of 0.2638, which isn't great, showing that these predictors aren't super great predictors for the overall score. And we can see that the session 1 individual score has a 40.87 increase in the mean squared error, meaning that when this variable is removed, the error of the model is increased by 40%, which is significant. However, looking at the overall explanation of how much our variables are impacting the overall score, this isn't a key finding. And then it is good to note that race, county, and gender are relatively low in importance, which is good, showing that our providers overall aren't having many biases for these categories. And we can see similar trends in the CGAS output as well, with the session 1 individual score being the highest, but overall this model actually performed worse than the ORS score, so we can't say much about the findings here.
So going forward, we looked at other machine learning models, so predicting score change versus overall score. So this is looking at ORS, so that is that scoring measured by the client. So it is from 0 to 40, and though it is a downward line, that just shows that so it is the client that began with a high score has less of an opportunity for that score to increase compared to a client with a lower score. So this will show that downward trend that we do see because the initial score increases, the opportunity for some of the increase for the score increase to be like reduced. So it is from 0 to 40, that is the scoring, but there is many dots below that is just showing that the client has not been able to, has reduced over the time, or that there is a lack in their scoring overall, which is definitely something to point out to our clients. And then going forward, we also looked at the CGAS score. So again, that's also the most recent session minus the first session. It is the exact same as the ORS, except it is just different. It's different graphing. So instead of 0 to 40, it's 0 to 100. There is a noticeable line at 0. So that dashed line there just represents that there was no change.
Okay, so overall findings and implications, some key takeaways from everything we talked about today. So during COVID, group had lower score changes, but not significant overall, but it is a difference that we wanted to look at. And then providers have an impact on score trajectory and discharge reason more than any other things that we started looking at. And ORS and CGAS scores vary in many cases. There is low correlation between the two scores in general, and then there is a low percentage increase in mean squared error in models from these two scores. And then score change by length and enrollment, there is really no correlation there, or at least not a significant correlation. So yeah, thank you guys for watching our presentation, listening, and thank you for your time. Bye.